when Leapfrog did his synopsis back in 1778, we mentioned this beginning of class period, he initiated a new and deeper search into the Gospels, and that really became source criticism. So throughout the 1800s, throughout the last century, this is the hot topic in New Testament studies, is what are the source relationships among Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we've surveyed the results of 150 years of scholarly activity when we have examined the four-source theory and the minority opinion that still is around the Leapfrog hypothesis. All other theories have been pretty much abandoned. So source criticism really was dominant in New Testament scholarship from roughly 1800 up to about 1920. The third method, form criticism, became the hot topic in New Testament studies between the two world wars, from 1920 to about 1950. That's the period of the heyday of form criticism. Form criticism is an attempt to return traditions about Jesus to their earliest form. Ultimately, what a form critic is interested in is the historical Jesus. A form critic wants to know, what did Jesus really say? Or what did Jesus really do? So how do you go about determining what Jesus really did or really said when we've got these four accounts of his life which differ to some degree or another? The synoptic problem that we referred to previously. Well, the form critics discovered that in reading a gospel, you can fairly well distinguish traditions that have been incorporated into a gospel. You can distinguish those from the kind of connecting statements that occur in between the passages. A synonym for passage is pericope. And I'm afraid that I'm going to start using that word just by accident and not notice that I do it. Pericope is a fancy word for a passage, like the Lord's Prayer is a passage, or the Sermon on the Mount is a passage, or the healing of the leper is a passage. All of those can be called pericopes. So if I use that word, you know what I'm talking about. I assume a passage. Okay. The form critics notice that when you read a gospel, you can fairly easily tell, especially when you compare the three synoptics, you can tell which are the passages themselves that originated in Jesus' words and deeds, and what are the connective sentences that the evangelists have added in between the pericopes in order to make them flow as a nice narrative. For example, if you look at Mark's gospel, you have things like, as soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house. Or, he cured many who were sick of various diseases and cast out many demons. Or, in the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out. Or, when he returned to Capernaum after some days. All of these are kind of connected linkages to to link one passage to the next. You find the same kind of links in the other Gospels, and even where the order is different, where they have rearranged the order of the passages so that the events are not recounted in the same order, you still get the same kind of connective tissue. Luke may move something from Mark later on, but he'll still say, the following day, Jesus such and such. So this is kind of like mortar in between the bricks, and the mortar seems to have been added by the evangelists in order to give you a nicely flowing narrative. So the first thing that the form critics did was to separate the traditions from the additions made by the evangelists. Now, since they're interested in the historical Jesus, they're interested in these, because these, they figure, are the items that have come down from Jesus. This is stuff that was added in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s by Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. And so the form critics, in effect, throw that away. They're not interested in that stuff. They want these, but they don't want these in their present form. They want to get them back in as early a form as they think they can possibly keep them. So they classify the pericopes by form, and that's where the name form criticism comes from. And they divide them into two types. There are sayings, and there are deeds. Narratives about what Jesus did. There are three types of sayings. There are proverbs. We saw last time that the usual term for those is aphorisms. Aphorism just means a one-liner, like man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. That's a proverb. And then you have short parables. Those are referred to as similitudes. Short parables are about 3, maybe 4 sentences long. Your typical similitude is 3 or 4 sentences long. Versus full-blown parables. Full-blown paragraphs are a full paragraph. Full-blown parables are a full paragraph long. An example of a similitude would be the lost coin that we read last time. Notice how short and sweet it is. What woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." Just so I tell you, there is joy in the testimony of God over one sinner who repents. That's pretty short and sweet compared to the Good Samaritan or prodigal son, which occupies half a page in the Bible. So you have these kind of quickie parables, and you have to have which are called similitudes, and then you have the full-blown short stories, short stories, which are called the parables proper. There's about 133 aphorisms in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You don't typically find aphorisms in John. There's approximately 30 similitudes. Some are borderline, depending upon which category you throw them in. And there's approximately 30 parables that Jesus told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John really doesn't have aphorisms, similitudes, or parables. He tends to have those course, aren't much interested in John because they're after the historical themes, and so they concentrate on the synoptics. So, they divide the pericopes into categories or forms. If it's a saying, then it's going to be an aphorism, a similitude, or a parable. On the other hand, if it's a narrative, if it's telling us something Jesus did, then once again, there's three basic types of form that the Jesus traditions fall into. There are miracles. Paralytic, leper, withered hand, whatever. Blind man, lame man. I think that's it last time. There's somewhere around 43 miracles in the Synoptic Gospels, plus 7 in John's Gospel, one of which is found also in the Synoptics. That's the feeding of 5,000. I'm trying to remember if that's the only one. I believe it is. The only one that's also in the Synoptics. So what's that text? Somewhere around 45 to 50 miracles, if you want to include John. In addition, there are what are called pronouncement stories, and there are special stories. Now, a pronouncement story is a story where the main interest is not in something Jesus did. Usually, it's not telling us what Jesus did, it's telling us about a conversation that Jesus had. And the main purpose of the story is so that Jesus can say a very clever one-line aphorism at the end of the thing, at the end of the tale. That's a pronouncement story. It's a story which exists in order to highlight a pronouncement that Jesus made. Special stories are kind of a catch-all category at the end. It's stories about Jesus that are neither miracles nor pronouncement stories, and they're unique to Jesus' life. There are other people who have done miracles, but only Jesus got crucified and resurrected. So that story, crucifixion and resurrection, is a special story about Jesus. Let me read you a passage. There is nothing hidden except to be disclosed, nor anything secret except to come to light. Which of these 6 forms do you think that would fall into? Aphorism, right? It's not a narrative about Jesus saying, and it's only a single sentence. Yeah, that's an aphorism. Good. How about the kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep night and day, and the seed would grow all by itself. The earth produces first the stalk, then the head, then the grain in the head, but when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with the sickle. Most scholars would say that's a similitude. About 3 or 4 sentences long, something like that. A pretty typical situation. I'm not going to read it, but I notice here on the same page you've got the sower. Now that's pretty chunky. And it's more like a short story. The guy out there, some of the grass falls here, some here, some here, some here. So that would be a parable. Now how about this one? As he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call them the righteous king's sinners. What else is the story? Oh, you guys are good.
We pay them in the right order.
Did I really? I didn't even notice that. Okay. Well, I'm not going to read you the whole Passion Resurrection narrative. Special story. Okay. Now, once the form critics have classified a pericope into one of these types, they then try to reverse any alterations that might have been made to the pericope in between Jesus back in 2730 and the evangelists writing in the period 65 to the 90s, somewhere in there. It appears from analysis of these traditions of Jesus that they went through a period of oral transmission to some extent because they're smoothed off. A lot of unnecessary detail has been eliminated. These are characteristics of oral transmission. And so the form critics will compare various versions of parables or whatever and try to establish the absolute earliest possible form of a given passage. We did that ourselves last time. We compared the two versions of the houses on rock and sand. Remember that? We decided that the one that used both rock and sand rather than that used rock with a foundation and rock without a foundation was the more original of the two. And then, once they've gone through this whole process, they now have the best possible evidence, they think, for establishing what the historical Jesus was really like. So that's form criticism. That's how it works. It really doesn't read the Gospels as continuous narratives.
Can you say this how many, what are these categories? Do you know how many ideas surrounding the story?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I've never stopped to add those up. I should do that so I can complete that. If I had to make a guess, I'd say probably 15 maybe.
Surrounding stories?
Yeah. That's a rough estimate just based on top of my head, but I think it's somewhere around it.
Is it just stories?
Oh gosh. Temptation, baptism, any stories that are unique to Jesus in his life. The Transfiguration, and depending on how you want to divide up the passion stories, you want to separate the trial from the mocking, from the arrest, and I don't know.
What category do we put in John's what was theology in John? Jesus seems to say exactly that he is God.
That's a good question. Those are those revelatory discourses that we talked about last time in John's Gospel. And since the form critics are interested in the historical Jesus, and since they've already decided that John's Gospel is a meditation on Jesus, and therefore is not trying to give us historical information the way that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are, they don't include John in their categories. This is synoptic material. I think most Catholic scholars would say that now, yeah. But that doesn't denigrate it in the least. It's equally as inspired as anything else. Oh yeah. I think whoever wrote John's Gospel was making assertions about Jesus and putting them in the mouth of Jesus. He may have, and if he didn't say exactly that, he said things similar to it. That's why John can write this meditation that says that sort of thing. Now, it's an excellent question you're asking, but you're really asking the question of historicity, exactly how do we know what actually happened versus what might have been made up later on.
But this is such an important gospel, proving that Jesus is in fact God, the Son of God, and perhaps in my own mind,
Well, you've read Paul's letters, right? Have you ever come across an assertion in Paul's letters that Jesus was Christ, the Messiah? Yeah. Virtually every page of Paul says something about Jesus' divinity, Son of God, and all this kind of stuff. Do you believe Paul less because he wasn't writing a historical document?
no.
Well, then why should you believe John less? Because he wasn't writing a historical document.
I thought he said it's very complicated, it's a beautiful gospel, and said,
Yeah, that may have been self-evident to the original readers. I don't know. This whole question, though, of historicity is a complex one, difficult to settle. Simply can't be settled. Let me just finish reaction criticism. And then maybe I can get back to yours during the question period. Reaction criticism is a way of approaching the Gospels that became popular from 1950 up to about 1970. That was its heyday. Reaction is a fancy word for editing. So reaction criticism means analysis of the editing that was done by a particular author. Reaction critics agree that the Gospels are largely traditions about Jesus embedded in a framework created by the evangelist in order to give you a nicely flowing narrative. But unlike the form critics, who separate out the pericopes and then throw away the framework, because after all, the form critics are only interested in the period around 30 AD. Reaction critics are interested in the evangelists. They're interested in the period 60s to 90s to 100. And so when they separate out pericopes from framework, they, in essence, throw away the pericopes and concentrate on the mortar, the various comments that the editors have added. What was the church like in the 60s, 70s, 80s? What were the concerns of the Christians of that time? What about this particular author, the one we call Mark? Did he have any special concerns that show up in the way that he has chosen to edit the traditions that he inherited? What about the way that Matthew has changed passages that he takes over from Mark? Is there any pattern to his changes that he makes to it? That kind of thing. All of that is reaction criticism, analysis of the editing that's done. And you know what? The reaction critics have, in fact, discovered certain special interests that each of the evangelists had in his gospel. One of the emphases, one of the things that Matthew emphasizes over and over is Jesus' fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. At the beginning of Matthew, for example, you have John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness of Judea proclaiming, "Repent." This is the one of whom the prophet Isaiah spoke when he said, "The voice of one crying out in the wilderness." Elsewhere it says, returned to their hometown of Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled, quote, he will be called a Nazarene. Later on it says, Jesus was led up by Satan into the wilderness to be tempted. And then you get, so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled, quote, land of Naphtali and land of Zebulun, etc., etc. You get all of these instances where Matthew sees some little incident about Jesus as fulfilling some Old Testament passage. There are 13 of these instances in Matthew's Gospel where he points out some fulfillment that Jesus has made to Old Testament prophecy. You don't get those in Mark, and you don't get them in Luke, and you don't get them in John. These are editorial additions, we presume, by Matthew. He may have gotten them from somebody else, but at any rate, they're immaterial. And they indicate a special interest on Matthew's part. Namely, how did Jesus fulfill Old Testament prophecy? Another special interest that the redaction critics have discovered by examining the editing that Matthew did in his gospel is, how did Jesus fulfill the Mosaic law? We know that in the Old Testament, the first 5 books are the law, and then later on you get the prophets. We've already talked about his interest in how Jesus fulfilled the prophets, but Matthew is also interested in knowing how did Jesus fulfill the Mosaic law. And that's why, for example, in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew has arranged all of Jesus' sayings into 5 big clumps throughout the narrative. Matthew's Gospel is structured so that you have a bunch of narrative, and then you have a very long set of aphorisms, similitudes, and parables. Then you have a bunch of narrative, then you get a bunch of sayings, then you get a bunch of narrative, a bunch of sayings, a bunch of narrative, a bunch of sayings, so that you wind up with 5 chapter, or sometimes 2 chapter, or in the case of the Sermon on the Mount, 3 chapter long collection of sayings by Jesus. Why 5? Why not 4? Why not 7? Most scholars think that Matthew is suggesting to his readers that just like Moses had the 5 books of Moses in the Old Testament, so here is the new law, the new Torah that we are to abide by. These 5 collections of sayings by Jesus. Again, there's a passage in Matthew chapter 5, verses 18 to 20, where Jesus says, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. That's a passage only in Matthew, and that's a passage about the Mosaic law. Immediately after it, Jesus contrasts his teaching with the Old Testament. You've heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not commit adultery. I say to you, do not even lust. You've heard that it was said to the men of old, do not murder. But I say to you, do not even get angry. Where does it say, do not commit adultery, do not murder? 10 Commandments, that's Old Testament. So, when it was said to the men of old, he means in the Old Testament. That's Torah. That's the Mosaic law. And so Jesus is contrasting his commandments with the commandments of the Old Testament. Now there's a couple of special interests on Matthew's part. Matthew is interested in how Jesus fulfilled the prophets, and he's interested in how Jesus is the new lawgiver. What is his relationship to the Mosaic law? You can find special interest in Mark's Gospel if you examine the way that he has edited the Gospels. For example, Mark emphasizes Jesus' authority. He's constantly showing Jesus being authoritative over demons, or over nature, or over the Jewish scribes. Another special interest in Mark's Gospel that the redaction critics have discovered is showing that Jesus' sufferings were part of God's plan. Mark is very intent on wanting to do that. Why would he want to do that? Well, probably because at the time he wrote, there were lots of Jews who were saying, why should I believe in this executed criminal Messiah? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So Mark says, wait a minute. Jesus' suffering is part of God's plan. And so his working out of that theme in his editing, that mortar material, is a special interest on his part. Luke has special interest. He's interested in how Jesus and the church are interconnected and how they fit into salvation history as a whole. He has a special interest in Jesus' compassion. Mark always emphasizes how Jesus is compassionate toward marginalized people, like the poor, sinners, women, Samaritans, Gentiles. This is a special emphasis in his gospel. One reason I like his gospel so much. He shows Jesus